Welcome to this episode of Out of the Best Books, the podcast where we deep dive into classic literature and have conversations about what we've learned and discovered along the way. We love all things books and reading, and we want to share our love of the classics with you. We hope to inspire you to read along with us and join in the conversation. I'm Amity.
And I'm Laura. Now let's get talking about the classics.
Okay, so today we're going to talk about The Secret Garden. And just to give a quick idea of what the whole book is about, and there's just so much to it. And it's a beautiful, wonderful book. But basically, it's the story of a young girl named Mary Lennox. She's about 10 years old when her parents are killed by cholera. At the time, they'd been stationed in India. Her father was a captain in the British Army. And I get the idea that she'd never been to England. I think that she, or at least when she went to India, she must have been very small. So it's the story of her going back to England, to the county of Yorkshire, and living with her uncle, who is her father's brother-in-law. So, and his name is Archibald Craven. So Archibald Craven's wife was Mary Lennox's father's sister, if that makes sense. So she goes to live with her uncle at this place, sort of a foreboding place called Misselthwaite Manor. And there we get the growth and of the evolution of Mary Lennox, going from a very spoiled and pampered and just sad and broken creature to a loving and beautiful creature. She discovers many things. She discovers many secrets, including this garden that the book is named after, as well as she discovers a lot about herself. And she discovers a boy who's just her age, and she discovers gardens and beauty and nature. And it's just a beautiful coming of age story. So I'm excited to talk about it. As far as the setting, it is, like I said, it's set in Yorkshire in England, and Yorkshire is sort of in the northeast part, and it is one of the largest counties in England. I think it actually is the largest, and it's just beautiful. And as I was sort of studying and researching for this, unfortunately, I haven't been to Yorkshire myself, but I would love to go there someday. But it's just vast and green, and there's this huge fields, and they always, whenever you're talking about Yorkshire, you have to talk about the moors. And the moors, again, are just huge, massive fields full of heather. And when heather blooms, apparently it turns purple and is beautiful. I did want to throw in there, though, that the author of this book, Francis Hodgson Burnett, she wrote it while she was planning her own garden. And a lot of people too think that she was very much influenced by both Jane Eyre, which is set in the moors of England, but also Wuthering Heights, which is definitely, that sort of lonely but beautiful and haunting the moors. And in the book, Martha even refers to the wind wuthering across the moors because it sort of makes this mourning sound. And so scholars believe that Francis Hodgson Burnett was heavily influenced by Wuthering Heights, by basically the Bronte sisters.
That's interesting. I listened, or as I was reading, I just kept thinking of Wuthering Heights.
Yeah, totally. Because it's sort of like this lonely and haunting thing, but it's also beautiful. And so I feel like she kind of draws out, there's the sort of scary sounds and whatever, but it's also, there's so much beauty and there's so much you can learn from the everything that happens on the moors. So
I don't know if you got this idea, but it's like, and because Wuthering Heights, well, she kept talking about weathering, like
yes,
at night when it's like rainy and windy, and use that word, and it was like in quotes all the time. But I got the idea that like they come, she goes on a ship all the way over to England, and then they travel over the moors into this like beautiful, like they go through this dreary, like she doesn't, she thinks it's nasty, and then they come over into this house, and funny thing is, one of the pieces of the setting I was thinking of, I think it said that the house was like 600 years old.
Yeah. Mrs. Medlock kind of gives her a history of the house, and we can talk about that more.
Yeah.
But she did talk about it, how it's 1600 years old. And so at that point, we're talking it was built in like the 1300s. So,
And
wow.
it's this, another part of the setting is this huge house with so many rooms and halls and, I mean, so many rooms that they don't all know who lives in the house. They
They
don't.
can literally hide from each other.
Yeah.
And yeah.
It's anyways, but when I read that, I was like, 600 years old. That's an old house. So really quick, some of the characters. So we have Mary Lennox, who's a young spoiled child that's pretty much raised by what they call ayahs in India. She doesn't really have much of a relationship with her parents. And then there's her parents who, like her dad is I think they said he was sickly, and a kind of a businessman, and her mom was just into the social life, so much so that that's why she ends up dying, is because, I mean, contracts cholera because she doesn't want to miss a dinner party. So yes, she's more into the social life, isn't really a mom. She just kind of passes that on to their servants to take care of her. Then she comes to England and meets Mrs. Medlock and Martha, who are kind of employees of the house, and Mr. Craven, who probably doesn't really want her there, and we don't really see or hear much of him through the book, right?
There's a little bit later on,
At the
but
end.
yeah. And we get to know him and his sadness, and really how his life is sort of a secret. And then Mary, through all the things that she does, she sort of unearths that secret as well. So the whole book is a bunch of secrets
Yeah, that's what I was
that
thinking. There's
are
lots of
discovered.
secrets
Yeah.
in this. Yeah, and he doesn't really want to be bothered by her in the beginning, and you, like, through the book you get to understand why he's like he is. So Colin is the son of Mr. Craven, right? Archibald Craven. And he's kind of sickly. He's hidden from everybody. Mary doesn't know about him when she first moves into the mansion. And he thinks that does he think he is a hunchback, or he's going to be?
He is very determined that he's going to be growing a hump on his back.
Like
He
his
doesn't
father.
right. He doesn't currently have one, but that's his biggest fear. So
Yeah, and so he's just kind of this character that does a lot of growing, just like Mary in the book. And
he's a really tragic character because he lost his mother as a baby. His father has had nothing to do with him. And so that's kind of where we start with Colin. He's hidden from Mary. Everybody else has to do what he says. And so
so he's spoiled, but yet probably lacks love. But I like watching him throughout the book, like, as he discovers that he's not limited into what, maybe everybody around him made him think that he was only going to be this one type of person. And Mary kind of comes in and opens his world up to the fact that maybe that's not how it has to be. Then there's Ben Weatherstaff, who's like the gardener, I think. Yeah. And he's kind of same thing with him. In the beginning, he's kind of cross with her, and he becomes her friend. I love Martha's mother, who just
so much, just the angel.
Yes.
I wanted to throw this in there really quickly as you're talking about them, if that's okay, because again, as I was studying about some of the background of the actual like original manuscript, like this is one of the books that people don't know as much about Miss Burnett's process, where I guess a lot of people knew about her process with like A Little Princess and Little Lord Fauntleroy, but they didn't know about this one as much. But someone actually got a hold of the original manuscript and found that she had originally written Susan Sowerby as having already passed away. So she was actually already dead to begin with. So she's somebody that they just sort of talked about and all the things that she said. But then she decided to make her a living creature, which I was so grateful for because I love her so much. So
yeah, she's amazing. She has several children that she raises in like a 1-bedroom cottage. And then yeah, she has an opinion about how they should handle Mary, and she just definitely has opinions about raising children, right? And Mary loves her. I like that too. And then we have Dickon, who is Martha's brother. He's 12 years old. And his character kind of reminded me of, maybe his name is Dickon too, from Mary Poppins.
Oh,
kind of like the
Bert.
chimney. Yeah, Bert. That's his name.
He's played by Dick Van Dyke. That's
Yes,
probably why
that's what I was thinking of. But like how he talks to the birds, and he like, anyway, so he talks to the animals, and he just knows everything about the plants, and he loves being outside. And I wrote that he loves to be in the moor and in the garden, and he talks to the animals, and he understands what they're saying. And she mentions that he talks to them differently than, say, Ben Weatherstaff talked to him, to the animals. And like another thing that surprised me about him was, I mean, you're reading it and you're like, you read the words, and then I went, wait, his pet is a fox. Like, that's it. Kind of like halfway through the book, it sunk in with me. A fox. So he really did talk to the animals that they like.
Let's stop and think. Yeah. To me, Dickon is sort of he's like this mystical fairy creature. Like they talk about magic a lot through the book, and he's sort of like the ultimate magical human being. Like he's sort of larger than life in the way that he's 12, and yet he can relate to like every kind of animal and every kind of person. And you notice how every person in the whole village, everywhere, knows who Dickon is. It's really interesting to think about.
Like he has talents and that stand out, and she just loves him from the beginning.
She's fascinated by him.
Yeah.
And it would take someone like that for her to actually, her curiosity to even be piqued, because before she didn't care about anything. So it was like, it had to be this magical and almost unreal person for her to even care. So
I love Colin. I love him. And then the last one I wrote down was Dr. Craven, which I thought was an interesting character, because if Dickon doesn't survive, he will inherit the property. And so he kind of almost has this invested interest in keeping Colin in bed, sick. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Is there any other characters you can think of that?
I did write down the Robin.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Because she sort of made the Robin another character, and it's really sweet.
Yeah.
And it really does pull together the whole theme of nature being healing, and nature pulling us out of ourselves, because it kind of is the Robin that triggered a lot of things for Mary and helping her in her healing process.
Yeah. I thought it was just, as I was listing these characters, I was like, there's actually a lot of prominent characters in this book. And you kind of get to know all of them. And anyways, and the for a children's book, I think there's a lot in there. There's a lot of lessons and like things you can tie together. And anyways, it's just fascinating. So chapter 1 starts with Mary, and I love like them talking about her appearance. I mean, thin face, thin body, thin hair, sour expression, like nobody likes her.
Everything about her is yellow too.
Yeah.
And it's one thing to have yellow hair, but she has yellow skin, and just, I wouldn't be surprised. Let's see. Yeah. She has a little thin face and a little thin body and thin light hair and a sour expression. Her hair was yellow and her face was yellow. So
apparently that's funny because for as my job, I sell little toys to kids, basically, for in little tiny toys in pediatric dentists and stuff. And do you want to know what their least favorite color is? Yellow.
Is it yellow?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. It's interesting.
So
I don't know why.
interesting.
Because like when I was a kid, I thought of yellow as being like a happy color, but
Yeah, you think of sunshine and sunflowers.
that's right. But like because of COVID, the kids now in some offices are able to pick their own toys instead of getting it out of the machine, and then they just get what they get. And what I get back is yellow.
That's so interesting.
So I'd like to know the like connection between that color. Like, is it? I mean, because why is she referring to her as yellow being, bad? But I mean, it could just be not having color from being outside or kind of sallow.
Yeah.
But they say that she's a child that nobody is fond of. Her parents don't even really like her. They don't have much to do with her. They can't keep nurses because they just keep leaving. And then like on the opposite side, her mother's beautiful and likes to be social, and it said that she cared only to go to parties and amuse herself with gay people.
Yeah. And that is what is so tragic to me, because you realize Mary truly is she's been extremely neglected and I mean, basically abused, because nobody has cared for her. Nobody's loved her. Her mother does not have natural affection. Like, she kind of hid her away from the beginning. It was like she didn't want to have a baby. And then she didn't. So Mary herself was kind of a secret, because people often forget that this beautiful woman even has a child, because she doesn't talk about her. She doesn't love her. It talks about how she would every once in a while, like, poke her head in the nursery when she knew Mary was asleep, so she wouldn't have to interact with her. So it's like, is there any wonder that Mary is just like a completely backwards and an awful little girl? No one has shown her what it means to love, because no one has loved her.
Right.
So,
well, yeah, it totally makes sense how she is. So they one day she wakes up and everybody in the they call it the bungalow, is coming down with cholera, and they forget about her. They just like, she's in her bedroom and everybody's dying. I think it starts with her nurse, maybe. And so nobody thinks about her. They're just like, okay, everybody's dying. And she comes out and she eats. I remember this from the movie when I was watching the movie when I was a little kid.
I love the movie.
And eating the food that was left over from the dinner party the night before. That they had abandoned, and she drinks some wine, which then makes her tired, and so she goes back to her nursery and falls asleep. And when she wakes up, she finds that everybody's forgotten about her. And a man comes in the room. I can't remember what he is, but like, he comes in and he finds her and a snake.
Yeah.
And
this is again where, what incredible trauma. And again, kind of going back to the mother, because there's this point where Mary finds herself alone. Her Aya is not coming to her. And so she sort of self-soothes by going out into the garden, which is sort of some foreshadowing for later, right? And from the garden, she peeks up and she sees her mother coming out. She comes out on a balcony and she's talking to this young and handsome soldier. And her mother is talking, they're obviously very concerned about the disease that's going around killing everybody. But her mother's first thought is not for her child. And that is so disturbing to me, that like, people around her are literally dying. Everybody's dying. And they know that it's going to spread super quickly. And her first thought is not her child. It's not even her second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, whatever thought. Like, her thought is herself and the dinner party she's going to miss and impressing this handsome soldier and whatever. And like, how horrible and how traumatic. And like, can we talk about the trauma that this little girl is going through when she realizes that everybody in her house is either gone or dead? Like, can you imagine that? So
And has forgotten about her.
awful. They've totally forgotten her. And
Yeah.
she's completely alone because everybody is dead or has just left.
Yeah. So, and then I love the title of chapter 2 is Mistress Mary Quite Contrary. And so she goes to stay with the English clergyman's family, and the kids don't like her. And so they gave her this nickname. And then they let her know that she's going to go sail over to England to live with her uncle. And so is it how do you say that? Misselthwaite?
Oh, Misselthwaite Manor.
Misselthwaite. I don't know. I guess I'm reading it. I need to listen to it so I can hear like how they say it quick. But and then Mrs. Medlock meets her once she reaches England, right? And I love this too. So Mrs. Crawford, who I think was with her on the ship, is like handing her over to Mrs. Medlock. And the book said they thought Mary was not listening because she was standing a little apart from them at the window of the private hotel they had gone to. She heard quite well and was very curious about her uncle and the place he lived. So like she's always listening
Yes.
to them talk about her, and they're just like talking about her like she's not there and she doesn't hear them. And I thought this was my thought about that. Like it was funny that the author focused on being curious about where she was going to go to instead of about what they were saying about her. Because they were saying that she's, this awful little girl that's been spoiled. But then she just hears about her uncle's house and she's like, I wonder where I'm going.
And that's a really good point because earlier on it talks about how she's very self-absorbed. She doesn't miss her mother. She doesn't miss her Aya because she doesn't care about anybody. She has no affection. And so that probably carries over in the fact that she doesn't care what anybody thinks about her either. So she may hear them talking, but it's like, why should she? At this time, she like has no feelings. She doesn't really even know what feelings are, but she does start to have a spark of curiosity. And if I really love this, let's see. There's a quote when they're traveling on the train. And she says she had begun to be lonely and to think queer thoughts, which were new to her. So this is sort of the beginning of her transformation and sort of the little bud poking out. So she has these queer thoughts. She had begun to wonder why she had never seemed to belong to anyone, even when her father and mother had been alive. Other children seemed to belong to their fathers and mothers. She stayed with the clergyman and she saw maybe she didn't get along with the kids, but she saw that their family actually liked each other. But she had never really seemed to be anyone's little girl. She had had servants and food and clothes, but no one had taken any notice of her. She did not know that this was because she was a disagreeable child. But then again, she did not know that she was disagreeable. She often thought that other people were, but she did not know that she was so herself.
Yeah, she's like, I mean, she hadn't experienced anything else. This is until after all this happens, and then she's like, maybe this isn't how families are. Maybe this isn't how children are treated. So this is the chapter where they talk about the houses. She's told on the way over there, the house is 600 years old. It's on the edge of the moor, and there's a near 100 rooms in it. Though most of them are shut up. Most of them's shut up and locked. That it's some of the book. I mean, I don't know that you listen to it. I need to listen to it because the English is it Yorkshire,
broad Yorkshire,
is hard.
Which is sort of a dialect, which is really interesting.
It's difficult to read, but they tell her, Mrs. Medlock tells her that Mr. Archibald is not going to trouble himself about her, and because he never troubles himself about anyone. And that he's a hunchback, he's never there. But then she tells her about what happened to her aunt, about his wife, and that he loved her and he'd do anything for her. And this is funny too, that everybody thought that she married him for his money. But she said, she had been around and she said she didn't. she knew that she had loved him. And anyways, so she tells her, don't expect to see him because he's not gonna be around.
Yeah.
Yeah. And she tells her, you're gonna have to take care of yourself.
Yeah, exactly. And so she's like, Mary's going, okay, well, I was alone in India. And she's probably thinking, well, okay, so I'm going to be alone in this place. But I think that in India, she did have servants who waited on her hand and foot. So she was probably expecting that. But I kind of love how clever this is all set up. So we have the Moors, which are sort of big and unknown to her. We have the broad Yorkshire dialect, which is unknown to her. We have this huge 600-year-old 100-room house, which sounds really kind of scary and mysterious. And the master of the house is a hunchback. And so it's like whose wife has died, and he's just this really sad, kind of angry guy. So it's really set up as kind of scary, especially for a 10-year-old. But this is what she's headed to.
Yeah, this book, you just reminded me, this book also kind of gives me Jane Eyre vibes.
Yeah.
The hidden, somebody's there, I can hear them, I don't know where they are, this huge house that's mysterious.
There was a scholar who said that this is like the child's version of Jane Eyre. Actually, I thought that was interesting. So
yeah,
and you get those vibes.
Yeah. So chapter 3, they arrive at the Thwaite station, which must be where they get on a carriage and go out to the house. And she says about the moors, it's just miles and miles and miles of wild land that nothing grows on but heather and gorse and broom. Nothing lives on but wild ponies and sheep. And she mentions that it's windy and dark. And this is what gave me the Wuthering Heights vibes.
Mm-hmm.
And this was, I thought, interesting that there was still, once they passed through the gates to Misselthwaite, there's still 2 miles to go. So it's like, this is a big, vast, place. And she says it feels like traveling through a dark vault. Yeah, I think this book does a really good job of describing the setting, so you get a really good, when you're out on the moors, you get a really good picture of what that's like. When you're in the garden, you get a really good picture of what she's trying to explain. So they arrive. She says the house is huge and intimidating. And then Mr. Pitcher, who is somebody who had kind of grown up, had been there as Mr. Craven has grown up, answers the door and tells Mrs. Medlock she's expected to keep Mary away from him. And then she's just taken into a room, like deep into the house that has a fire and supper ready for her. And she's told to stay in the room.
Yeah. And I kind of love this because it says Mary has never felt quite so contrary in her life. But I was thinking about that and I was like, anger and contrariness, if you will, they're always secondary emotions. And she's never been taught emotions at all. And so when she actually is feeling sad and abandoned and hurt and frightened and lonely, she's just contrary.
Right.
And that's how she treats everybody. Okay. So chapter 4 finds us in Mary's bedrooms. Well, her rooms. She wakes up in the morning. It's the morning after she arrives, and she meets Martha. And something we've talked about with when a book is a classic, it transports us to places that we have never been before, wouldn't ordinarily go. And in this case, it totally transports both us and the main character to Yorkshire. And she learns all these things that she never, it's all completely foreign to her. Not just the Yorkshire countryside, but the broad Yorkshire, the dialect that we talked about, which she's familiar with the idea of dialects because she knows that in India, I think there's well over 100 dialects. She knows that, but these people are not speaking just the normal straight up English, British English that she's used to. And Martha is very much, um, she even calls herself common. She comes from a family of 12 children. She says that in this family of 12 children, her father brings home 16 shillings a week, which I did just a little bit of research to find out. And that is less than £1 a week, a British pound. And for that period of time, I'm not totally sure how that would transfer to today, but I mean, if you thought, just to make it very simple, like less than $1 a week for 12 children. So um her mother, she praises her mother all the time, and she says, my mother has quite a time of it just trying to find, porridge for all these children. But at the same time, the children are very healthy. She talks about how they tumble about the moors and they just play and they love each other. And so that is all quite foreign to Mary. So all that to say that she meets Martha. Martha has a lot to say. She, in other great houses in England, she most likely would, if she was hired, she would probably be a scullery maid, not somebody going and serving the people in the rooms, because she is very common and she talks a lot. But this is so good for Mary. It's like the very best thing that could happen to her at the time. Martha is so surprised that Mary thinks that she should dress her. And Martha's like, "Cannot you dress yourself?" She's like, I have a little sister who's like 3 and she can dress herself. Like, what's wrong with you, type of thing. And she quotes her mother and she says, "Mother always said she couldn't see why grand people's children didn't turn out fair fools. What with nurses and being washed and dressed and took out to walk as if they was puppies." And so the life of the wealthy is quite foreign to Martha, who comes from a family where they're competent. They can take care of themselves. They're very self-reliant. And she comes to this house where these people are wealthy and they can't do anything that's basic. So
yeah, I love like when Mary just holds her arms out.
Yeah.
And Martha's like, "What are you doing?"
Yeah.
She's like, "Aren't you gonna dress me?"
Yeah. And Mary is not used to that at all. And again, like I said, I think it's the very best thing for her, because Martha is the oldest of 12 children and she's not going to put up with Mary's brattiness. So also during this conversation, Mary hears about Dickon for the first time. And this is so good because it says she began to feel a slight interest in Dickon. And I think that curiosity is another thing that is foreign to Mary. She's never cared about anybody and she's never been curious about anything. But she hears about Dickon and finally she has the sensation of curiosity. She's interested in him. And it says, and as she had never before been interested in anyone but herself, it was the dawning of a healthy sentiment. A lot happens in this chapter. Martha also like I said, Martha is very chatty. And she also tells her about the garden that's locked up. And Mary starts to be curious about that. Martha tells her that she should get outside. Like there's no reason for her to just stay cooped up inside. It's like the weather's not bad, so she should go outside. And when she does, she meets the robin for the first time. And she also sees the huge gardens and sees, at this point, it's winter. So she sees the wintry moor and the big gardens, and they're so vast and huge, but also empty. There's nobody around. And she feels really lonely. And I think that she starts to realize that what she's feeling is loneliness.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought of that here. She also learns why the garden is shut up, and
yes,
learns a little bit more about Mr. Craven and his wife.
Do you want to go into that? Because I kind of skipped over that.
She just tells him that his wife had died suddenly, and then we later find out that, well, because she's not supposed to know about Colin yet, but that she died in childbirth, and that he loved her and she loved this garden. And so when that happens, then he locks the door and buries the key. That's what I think they said. And Mary kind of wonders, well, if he loved her so much, then why would he hate the garden so she doesn't understand that. But yeah, and when she sees the robin, she kind of wonders if the robin had come from the garden.
Yeah, because she sees these walls,
Yes.
and lots of the walls have doors that she can go in, and she sees these gardens, but there's this one wall that she sees the robin come from, and she doesn't, it's not apparent where the door is. And I believe that the death of Mrs. Craven, one of the reasons that Mr. Craven hates the garden so much is because she was sitting on a tree in the garden and the branch broke and she fell. And I believe that like that set her into labor, if I'm remembering correctly. And you're right, she died in childbirth, but it was sort of like the events were said about because of
Tied to the garden.
she was right. And so he was really, he had to be angry at something. And so he was angry at the garden.
I had forgotten about that part, but and now I remember that she was sitting on the tree, and yeah, so he's like bitter against the garden too.
Yeah.
And it makes me wonder if everybody around there probably knows where the door is, because they've all been like, I think Ben Weatherstaff was there, I think, Mrs. Medlock. So Mary's the only one that is like doesn't know, she's just the one that is in the dark, I guess, about. And
it's a
they all
secret,
know
but it's only a secret to her.
Yeah, and they all know, they just leave it alone. And Ben tells Mary that she's unattractive and nasty tempered, and she thinks, "Am I?"
And that was that's another thing. Again, talking about sort of this different culture that she's going to get used to. It talks about how Yorkshire people just speak their mind, and again, she's used to all these her Indian servants who are going to just salaam and tell her anything that she wants to hear. They didn't like her, but they're just going to tell her anything she wants to hear. And so Ben Weatherstaff is just speaking his mind, and he's pretty much as ornery as she is, and that's like super good for her because she needs somebody that's going to tell her what's what. And so he did. He's like, "Oh, you're not a very pretty little girl," basically.
The last thing that I liked in this chapter was that she asks the robin to be her friend, and then she's surprised by the tone of voice that comes out of her. She's like, "Who is this?"
Yeah.
I thought that was
and yeah, absolutely. And I think that's when Ben Weatherstaff was like, "Oh, you just about sounded like a real little girl right there." You sounded almost human. And it's during that time, it says that Mary gets a queer feeling in her heart. She had not known before that her loneliness was one of the things which made her feel sour and cross. So she's learning about emotions. And she seemed to find it out when the robin looked at her and she looked at the robin. And so I really, I feel like one of the big things that Francis Hodgson Burnett is trying to tell us is that nature helps us to be self-aware and learn about ourselves when we spend time in it, and we observe and just take that time. We can become a lot more self-aware and mindful. So
yeah, I've well, you know that I recently had a allergic reaction to something, and one of the people that I was consulting on what I should do to like either speed it up or make it stop suggested walking outside with bare feet to like connect with, I know this is a little woo-woo, right? But like to connect with the earth. And so I think sometimes, and what's interesting too is she's beginning to connect with like nature and earth and everything. And then we're going to meet Colin, who never breathes fresh air, hasn't really been outside. I mean, he's just totally deprived of all of this. And, then she's going to open him up to that world too. But yeah, so there you go. There's some advice. Walk outside in bare feet once in a while. I don't know.
Well, like, honestly, I don't think I would discount it, like, because it's worth a try. I mean, you never know. And it's, she talks in here about the magic, and the magic is nature. And there is this energy that surrounds all of us. And I think as we become in touch with it, maybe it has healing powers as well. And I think that's what she's trying to get across here too, is that it heals Mary emotionally and mentally, and then it heals Colin emotionally, mentally, and physically. And it's very beautiful that way.
I think you can get a lot from being outside and enjoying nature.
Yes.
You know, it can heal your soul.
Yeah, definitely. So moving on to chapter 5, we get the idea now that Mary is spending lots of time outdoors. She is learning to love it, and she's realizing that she feels good afterwards. Again, she's starting to learn what feelings are, and she learns that being outside helps her to feel good. And in this chapter, she learns what it is for the first time, like what it means to be hungry. Because earlier on, Martha's telling her about her brother, all of her brothers and sisters, and how it's so hard to keep them fed. Like they're hungry a lot of time, but they're not unhappy. They just, that's just how it is. And Mary's like, I don't even know what it means to be hungry. She's never had to be hungry because she's never had to think about where her food's coming from. And also she's been completely inactive. So she's never like worked up an appetite. So for the first time, she's outside and she's exploring so much. And so she actually knows what it is to be hungry, which we know is a healthy thing.
This is the chapter where they tell how she died, that she fell off the branch of the tree. That's why it's like,
okay.
And the first time they mentioned the wind is wuthering outside. That's another interesting thing.
Okay. Oh, yes. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. Well, so just to back up a little bit, this chapter is showing us that Mary is evolving. It says that she stayed out of doors nearly all day. And when she sat down at her supper at night, she felt hungry and drowsy and comfortable. Those were not unpleasant things to her. She did not feel cross when Martha chattered away. She felt as if she rather liked to hear her. And at last she thought she would ask her a question. And so you're right. I kind of jumped ahead before, but she asks Martha, because that curiosity is coming to her, why Mr. Craven locked it up. So, and that's when she finds out that Mrs. Craven fell from the tree. It hurt her so badly. She had her baby. Well, she doesn't at this time. She doesn't know that Mrs. Craven had a baby. It just said that Martha just tells her that she was hurt so badly that she died, and Mr. Craven locked up the garden and essentially threw the key away.
One of the sentences I like too is that, she's, like you said, she's comfortable, she's hungry, she's moving around more, she's like, I'm feeling things I've never felt before. I'm, interested, curious. She had never felt like that before. But one of the sentences they said was, the fact was that the fresh wind from the moor had begun to blow the cobwebs out of her young brain and to waken her up a little.
I love that. And it's so true. And it becomes very vivid, and going right along with that. She's getting all these feelings and thoughts, and it talks about how it says at that moment, a very good thing was happening to her. 4 good things had happened to her, in fact, since she came to Misselthwaite Manor. She had felt as if she had understood a robin and that he had understood her. She had run in the wind until her blood had grown warm. She had been healthily hungry for the first time in her life, and she had found out what it was to be sorry for someone. And in that moment, she felt sorry for Mr. Craven, even though, when she got there, she learned he didn't want anything to do with her. And she hadn't seen him. I don't know how long she'd been here at this point, how long she'd been there right now, but she'd never seen him. And as far as she knows, he wants absolutely nothing to do with her. But she still is able to feel sorry for him because she knows that he's had sadness. And she's had extremes. What's that?
He learns his story.
He learns his story. And the thing is too, like, her story is just as is, if not even more tragic, but she's able to be sorry for him. The last thing in this chapter is that she hears the crying for the first time. And we talked about the withering across the moors, and so that it sort of had a mournful sound. And Martha was able to convince her at first that that's all she was hearing. And then Mary was like, the wind wasn't even blowing, you know? And so, no, it wasn't that. I know it was inside. And so Martha said, well, it was probably little Betsy Butterworth. She has a toothache. She's crying. Okay. So we know that there's some secrets that are unraveling. She's learning about the secret garden, and what its secrets are. And now there's a whole other big secret too, which I think is really clever writing.
Yeah, Mary keeps saying it's coming from inside. I know it's coming from inside. And it's like, oh no, it's the wind. But she's like, I don't think so.
Exactly. So in chapter 6, this one is pretty concise. There is wind on the moors now, and there's lots of rain, like so much so that it's not worth going outside. So she has to stay indoors. And Martha is like, well, you could knit. She's like, I don't know how to knit. You could do this. I don't know how to do that. And Martha's like, don't you know how to do anything? And, but something Mary does ask is, how do you guys do it on crazy days like this? You know, because she know, which again, I love because it's these sparks of curiosity, because she knows the Sowerby family, there's 12 kids and they have a tiny cottage. So she's like, how do you guys do this? It's a very mysterious other life that she's wondering about. And Martha's like, we just try to not, kill each other basically. And there's like a barn that some of the kids go play in. But Martha does encourage her to kind of go explore. Well, she gives her the idea of the library, and Mary's like, oh, I'm going to find it myself. And so she goes and starts exploring around the house, supposedly looking for the library, which she is. But in the meantime, she's also able to unlock the secrets of all these, not all of them, but a lot of the rooms. And one thing that do you remember, like some of the pictures that she saw, the paintings?
Children in strange clothing. Mm-hmm. And she's like, I wish these kids were here so I have somebody to play with. Yeah. She finds the mice with 6 babies. She plays with some ivory elephants.
And that was interesting. I kind of wondered, I thought that was kind of cool, because I was like, I don't know how long her father had been stationed in India, but maybe those were little elephants that he like sent to his sister or something. Maybe that was sort of alluding to that.
Yeah. I never thought, I didn't even think about that. But then she hears a child crying again, right?
She hears the crying again. And just at that moment, Mrs. Medlock discovers her and she's like, I'm going to box your ears. And I feel like that's something that we hear a lot in like sort of the old stories and things. Like, that is like so brutal. Like, why would someone even threaten to do that? But
she drags her, and then she just drags her back to her room. Like, you're, and she threatens to lock her up if she doesn't say where she's supposed to stay, right?
Yeah. They're
desperate to keep her in her own little area so she doesn't find out about Colin, right? Yeah. And then chapter 7 is where she finds the key. So I love this too, that Martha goes home once a month to help her mother. One day a month she gets off, and what she does when she goes home is cook and clean and give her mom a day off. Like, what a rest.
She actually doesn't get a day off, but she's so happy about it. It's just the sweetest thing.
And she has to walk 5 miles to get to their cottage. So what? I mean, poor Martha. She's amazing.
She is amazing.
And then Mary, so she goes outside and she talks to Ben, asks him questions about things that grow in England. And then she sees the robin again, and she finds the key, which I think the robin shows her where the key is, right?
Yeah.
And they're like,
she's kind of like following the robin along, and then she discovers this flower bed, and some of the earth has been turned up, and it looks like a dog had been digging, and she just sees this iron ring, and Again, she follows her curiosity, discovers the ring is hooked to a key.
Yeah, she's like, I think this might be the key. Yeah, so I think that chapter is pretty shortly. She kind of just finds the key, has a little conversation with Ben. And then in chapter 8, she has the key, but she can't find the door. And she keeps saying, like, there's got to be a door here, but she's just looking and looking and looking, and she can't. There's ivy growing over it, right? All the walls, and so she can't seem to find a door where she could try this key. And then Martha comes back from her day off at home, and she had told her family all about Mary, and they loved hearing about her. What was one thing they mentioned earlier in the book, I think, is that like they expected her to be a native Indian.
Yes. They thought that she was, Martha says, I thought you were going to be Black.
Yeah. And so the kids were like interested in that she was this fair-skinned girl that had come from India, and told her all about, told her family all about her. And she gets her mother, which, like you said, they're so poor, but her mother buys Mary a skipping rope because she thinks it's important for her to be outside and be active. And she's very judgmental of the fact that Mr. Craven hasn't hired anybody to help with her, isn't interested in getting to know her or anything.
Yes.
And it said that she bought it from a peddler for $0.02. Do you happen to look up how much that is?
It's just 2 pennies.
2 pennies.
And I'm not sure how that compares to shillings, but it's less, obviously a lot less. It's 2 pennies.
Yeah.
So it's just the way that they say it. They blend 2 pence together.
2 pence. Yes, tuppence. Yeah.
Tuppence.
And that's that also reminded me of Mary Poppins, because
tuppence.
Yeah.
I love it. I think, again, Mrs. Sowerby is just this angel, and it really gives us this incredible insight into the fact that wealth, or the lack thereof, is not what matters at all, because you have this house full of people. There's so much wealth in the huge Misselthwaite Manor, so much wealth, and everybody's just fine, but they cannot be bothered with anybody but themselves. And so they're just these bitter, awful people. But then you have the Sowerbys, who are so poor, but that's what they do, is they think of other people, and they end up blessing so many lives because of it. And there's this quote from Mrs. Sowerby, and she says, now, Martha, you just think how you'd feel yourself in a big place like that, wandering about all alone and no mother. You do your best to cheer her up. And it's like, she's this wealthy, very privileged girl. But Mrs. Sowerby recognizes that all the money and all the wealth and all the privilege in the world means nothing if you have no love.
Yeah.
And nobody to care for you.
Yeah. I know.
So,
I love her mom. She's just
fantastic.
And
And that beautiful sacrifice of using some of that money that could have probably bought a lot of food for their little family, because she cared so much about Mary and knew that she needed something. But then, do you remember how Mary sort of like this, she has this light bulb moment after Martha gives her the jumping rope? She realizes, so there's this kind gesture, and it was so thoughtful towards Mary. And as a result, it kind of makes her a little more thoughtful, because number one, she's like, oh, well, I'll tell you guys more about India. I'll tell you more about India so you can go back and tell your brothers and sisters. But then also she realizes, oh, Martha, that was your money that was used to buy my skipping rope. It's like she suddenly becomes aware that there's not just her in the world, and there's other people working and laboring for her.
I wrote that down, that Mary thanks Martha for spending her wages on her, and it's awkward. I think it mentions that. It's like she doesn't know how to thank her. But
yeah.
She's
probably never thanked anybody before.
Yeah, she's like, oh, you spent your money on this. Like, yeah, it's like connecting with her, right? And she's maybe understanding Martha's situation more and more, that she works so hard there and then she goes home. More, I mean, can you imagine getting off once a month, one day a month? That's just like, it's insane. So she gets the rope and she goes outside and starts practicing. And I think Martha says, I can skip 100. Well, I can skip more than 100, but I could skip at least 100. And at first Mary can only do a few, and then it says that she can do 20, and then she can do 30, and then she's practicing. And then the wind blows the ivy aside. She sees the door and is able to get in. She slips inside the garden. So we're finally, I feel like this book has a lot of buildup. Like we do I mean, we're in chapter 9 now,
8.
and she just,
Well, now 9, yeah.
9, and she just got into the garden. And then like, we haven't even really seen Dickon yet. So like, it's just kind of a big buildup for, anyway, it takes a while. Yeah, and so in chapter 9, she's in the garden and she doesn't know if it's alive. You know, if the plants in there are alive, and she's there, it says there's no leaves or buds. She doesn't know if they're dead, but she sees these sharp little pale green. I wrote groins. I don't know if that's the actual word that they used, but it might be a typo. Pointing up from the ground, that she says indicates that some of the garden was still alive. There was something that was growing, and she kind of weeds a little bit to like give room for those little green buds that are popping up.
Yeah, which again I think points to the fact that she's growing in her she is still evolving, because she thinks to clear the stuff away from the little tiny green and growing things so that they have more room, and kind of freshen things out.
Yeah, how often do they say previous to this, like she just didn't ever care about anything before?
No. Yeah, she just didn't care about anything.
Yeah.
Or anybody. She was completely self-absorbed. That's all she knew. Nobody loved her. She didn't love anybody.
So this just shows her like, oh, I'm curious. I'm like, this is yeah, she cares. She wants it to be alive. She's excited about it. So then she goes back to, it said early dinner, so that must be like a lunch time, right? She goes back in and she asks her about these things that look like onions. She calls them these little white roots that look like onions. And Martha says, oh, Dickon knows about those. He knows everything about
he knows everything.
Yes. And she says about him, our Dickon can make a flower grow out of a brick wall. Mother says he just whispers things out of the ground. Like you said, magical, right?
He's this like magical fairy person.
Yeah.
Something else I loved about that, because she's talking about the bulbs. And so these are, well, they talk about it. They call daffodils daffodillies, which is like the cutest name ever. And I think we should still call them that. And crocuses and snow blossoms and probably some tulips or something. So it's all those bulbs that, they go underground in the winter and then they spring up and they just keep coming back. But she says, Mary asks, do bulbs live a long time? Would they live years and years if no one helps them? Because she knows that these are the ones in the garden. Martha doesn't know that. So she's like, maybe these have been around since Mrs. Craven was there. And Martha says, they're things as helps themselves. That's why poor folk can afford to have them. If you don't trouble them, most of them will work away underground for a lifetime and spread out and have little ones. There's a place in the park woods here where there's snowdrops by thousands. They're the prettiest sight in Yorkshire when the spring comes. No one knows when they was first planted. So they're these sort of independent and self-reliant little flowers that are sort of like the sorbies, that they just keep going and bring delight and keep coming back.
So, I don't know much about flowers. So I'm always asking my mother-in-law, is this something that's going to come back or something? Or is this a one-time thing? She always knows. Great.
Yeah.
But this is when she realizes that she's going to need to keep this a secret, or she's afraid Mr. Craven's going to get mad and lock her out of the garden. And then and I think it's at lunch that she asks Martha, like, how can I get a spade without telling her anything, right? About finding it. And Martha suggests that Dickon can get her some seeds. And she says he knows the prettiest ones. I love it. I love that he's just like one with the earth, and he knows everything. He's the authority.
He knows everything. He's the perfect child.
Yeah. And she writes him a note. I think she writes it from as if it was written from Martha.
Mm-hmm.
That's the impression I got, asking him to get her some seeds.
Yeah.
And then they talk about Mary maybe going with Martha to visit her family sometime.
Yeah, because Mary decides that she really likes Susan Sorby, that she really likes Dickon. And early on, she was like, yeah, I like them, but I don't think they'd like me. And Martha says, well, do you like yourself? Why would you think that they wouldn't like you? And Mary says, no, I don't like myself. And so there's a lot of growth that needs to happen, but she starts in a good place because she likes these people, and they are good people to like. She recognizes goodness when she sees it.
Yeah. And I mean, she hasn't met them, but she's like, I think I'm going to like these
Everything
people.
that she hears are really good things.
And so Martha leaves her, and here's again, far off moaning. That's what they say. And I think Martha comes back, and Mary asks her about it, and Martha just kind of leaves without saying anything. She's like, I'm not going to expound on this, or
you should go walking in the corridors.
Yeah. I mean, what's interesting is later in the book, you find out that all of these children, all of Mrs. Sorby's children, know about Dickon. And
about
they
Colin.
know
about Colin.
Yeah, sorry. I got their names to mirror. Yeah, about Colin. And they know that she's not supposed to know. And they're afraid that they'll get in trouble if so. It's like, oh, you don't hear anything.
And what do they think? If she's supposed to live there forever, do they really think that they were going to keep a secret like that forever? Yeah. And it's a heavy thing to put on Martha, because we find out later that Martha is the nurse for both. Well, not the nurse, but she's the maid for both Colin and
she relieves the nurse.
Yeah, she does. But she does the cleaning up and stuff. So no matter what, she's in there a lot.
She's in both. I know. It's just come on, guys. You guys all live in the same house. How did they actually think they could keep them apart all this time?